How much time needs to pass before grave robbing turns into archaeology? If you're opening the grave to make money, you're a grave robber. If you're spending money to open it, you're an archaeologist. In North America, archaeologists have to be extremely careful with any kind of Native American burial. Nowadays it's more and more common that archaeologists might get a chance to look at a burial, but they put it back in place as best as they can when they are done. So they study the burial, but take nothing from it. This is because the living ancestors of these ancient people still like to honor their dead. There's also a methodology component to it. Regardless of the age of the remains, if I womble up with a metal detector, dig a hole and yoink out anything of value, that's grave robbing. If I fight for months for planning approval, record every detail of the site in obsessive detail, then refill any holes carefully when the funding has run out, even though there's still more to discover, that's archaeology. Plus, archaeology is not just graves. Please Google Canuic Man. Could be thousands of years depending on the relatives. Like 20 minutes. I'm an archaeologist, currently conducting postgraduate research focusing on early medieval trade in the North Atlantic, which is a fancy way of saying Viking fishermen. As others have said, it's not a matter of time as much as it is intent. Grave robbing is an unsanctioned, for-profit endeavor. Archaeology is a legally permitted, scientific examination for the purpose of understanding the past. Generally speaking, exhumation of recently interred remains for those purposes is forensic, rather than archaeological, despite similar methodology as it's usually conducted in the course of a criminal investigation. Contrary to the popular imagination, burial archaeology is probably only about 10% of the science, if that. Most of it is mundane shit like analyzing fishbone assemblages. I actually had to look this up once for reasons. It's 100 years *OR* when the deceased has no remaining living relatives, whichever comes first. I guess you can say the answer, EUR cent / EUR cents, EUR cent / EUR cents, / is buried somewhere in this thread. I'm an archaeologist. It depends on where you live. In the US, most, if not all states have laws prohibiting the purposeful disturbance of burials. This includes ones that are 2 years in the ground to 10,000 years. Native American burials are further protected by federal laws. If you're an archaeologist and you come across a burial on a site, you need to notify the county coroner, the local police, your state's historic preservation office, and potentially the local Native American tribe. They will make determinations as to its approximate age, and if an investigation is needed, what happens to the remains, or if there is a possibility / need for notification of next of kin. Then you dig it up. Most of the time, it is pretty straightforward, and it is dug up. Generally speaking, as an archaeologist in the US, you do not go looking for burials to purposely dig them up, unless there is a good reason, since it triggers all sorts of laws and questions of ethics. I think the grave could be thousands of years old, it's still grave robbing, if you're doing it to sell, and for wealth, and not under strict guided scientific theory. Like there's a big problem in Africa and the Middle East and even China where dudes dig up old graves with bulldozers and just sell that shit. I'd call them grave robbers. Back in the 19th century, archaeologists were just glorified grave robbers taking Egyptian artifacts back to their European museums. It isn't time, it is intent. Grave robbing is to plunder the grave for valuables. Excavating an archaeological site is to learn. As an archaeologist, I think this is a very weird question. I usually wait for the family to leave. It's a bit of a grey area really. Most archaeology is developer-led these days. The only reason the site gets excavated is because it's going to be developed for housing, industry, quarrying, etc. In these cases the site is going to be trashed, and full excavation is only done as a last resort, to ensure features and finds are properly recorded, removed, and stored before they are destroyed by heavy machinery. Most reputable archaeologists would recommend that things are best left in the ground and undisturbed if at all possible, regardless of age. So, on development sites, the age of the grave really doesn't matter, but speaking from experience, if it's wrapped in carpet, found in the topsoil, or has better trainers than me. As an archaeologist, I'm still calling the cops. Anything else gets excavated to the highest professional standards and treated with respect. Also, if it's been done for archaeology, you need a license to handle human remains. I guess grave robbers are not bothered by such red tape. Until all the living relatives at the time of death are dead. But then there is the obvious problem of only children with no children themselves with few relatives, so IDK. It's not a question of time, but rather a question of hats. You could also be a grave robber of prehistoric artifacts. Archaeology is dedicated to preserving the finds and putting them into the right historical context. Grave robbers just want money. Depends how many guns the people who have a problem with it have. Depends which side of the gunboat you're on. Well, at least it did. Since archaeology is for the purpose of discovering the past and not for personal profit, I'd say they are never the same thing. For me to consider it moral, it has to be when you are trying to study a culture that no longer exists or something that we don't know about. Because it is not like you are going to dig up George Washington and call it archaeology. We did not learn anything. As an anthropology student, TBH, I must say that it's a question that has no real answer. In my own opinion, funerary archaeology will always be grave digging, regarding of the time that passed. When Egyptologists find a new tomb in the Valley of Kings/Queens, they'll remove the belongings of the dead and even his bodies to expose them in a museum. Even if the person has been dead for 3,000 years, I think it can still be messed up to steal one's offerings and body to expose them to the masses. Because the removal of the artifacts and people from their tomb, the best archaeologists can do is record the context, stratum, disposition of artifacts, precise area on the site where it was found, in order that the grave itself is remembered as it was before it was disturbed. The first rule of archaeology: it belongs in a museum. If you take notes, it's science. If you don't, it's just fucking around. I am not sure, but I can tell you for certain that it is generally frowned upon if you start before the funeral is over. During my archaeology degree, the professor in one of the first lectures said, the only difference between archaeology and grave robbing is that it's archaeology when enough time has passed for there to be no living descendants left to object to it. It's good form to wait until the funeral is over. You just need to wait for the family to leave, otherwise it is disrespectful. It is only archaeology if it is from the archaeologic region of France. Otherwise it is just sparkling grave robbery. Right? I am thinking at least 100 years. Semicolon. Grave robbers do it for the profit, while archaeologists do it to preserve the past. In England it is usually 250 years for cemeteries and churchyards, but when it comes to recycling graves it varies. Usually paupers' graves can be done after 50 years, unless they have a headstone. It is rare, but it happens. Then you have to find a living relative. I'm going with, if you have a degree and permission from the government to actually dig there. Like there is archaeology on WW2, Vietnam, and Cold War sites. I mean, sure there are dead bodies, but it's not grave robbing in a sense. For the average person with no degree, probably look up a different answer. I once posted a similar question to r/ask historians and received an answer that essentially boils down to Adarita Pern. So anyway, just wanted to say check out r/ask historians. It is a great sub for questions like this. This is a loaded question. Archaeology is not grave robbing. It is like equating medical doctors with Mengele. Mengele may have had a medical degree, but he was not interested in medicine. According to my lawyer, more than one day. If you get paid before you dig, archaeology. Get paid after you dig, grave robbing. Source: I'm disgraced archaeologist. Once a civilization or society has gone extinct, and as soon as another culture does it, it's archaeology. Ask a native of South America or North America how they feel when their ancestral lands are taken by colonizers who later disturb them further, and call it archaeology. Doesn't matter the time past, to those whose culture it is, it may always be grave robbing. It belongs in a museum. Turns out my house is a museum. I'm not sure, but my urn is going to be full of spring snakes.